May 18, 1945. Sugarloaf Hill, Okinawa. Rain has turned the slope into a chute of gray mud, and the mud is not clean. It is mixed with cordite ash, spent brass, and things men do not talk about afterward. Corporal Elias Marsh of the 2nd Battalion, 22nd Marines lies against the base of the hill, back pressed into a shell scrape barely deep enough to matter. 68 pounds of gasoline and pressurized nitrogen sit strapped to his spine. He has carried this weight up and down this same 50 feet of coral rock 4 times in 6 days. 3 of those times, the hill has been given back to the Japanese by nightfall. Marsh checks the igniter housing on his gun the way another man checks his watch, automatically without looking, fingers reading the mechanism by feel. 2 Marines down the line are dead because a flamethrower failed to fire at the mouth of a cave, and the cave did not stay quiet. Marsh does not know their names. He knows the number, 2. He knows it the way infantrymen know the exact statistics that might apply to them personally. 50 yards up the slope, in a firing position cut into volcanic rock, a Japanese machine gun crew of the 32nd Army waits inside a defensive complex their commanders consider unbreakable. Japanese training doctrine of 1945 held a specific, repeated assumption about the American infantryman, that he was industrial but soft, dependent on machines he did not understand, and unwilling to close distance for a kill. Cave defense doctrine on Okinawa was built around this assumption directly. Let the Americans come close enough that their artillery and air power became useless, and their individual courage would fail against a Japanese soldier's willingness to die in place. It was, on paper, a sound doctrine. It had worked in some form on Peleliu, on Iwo Jima, in the ridgelines above Naha that the 6th Marine Division had already bled for. General Mitsuru Ushijima's 32nd Army had spent nearly a year turning this stretch of southern Okinawa into a honeycomb of interconnected tunnels, spider holes, and burial vaults converted into pillboxes, each one covering the approaches to the next. It was a defense built to survive naval gunfire, built to survive artillery, and built to make every yard of ground cost the attacker in blood and time. Nobody who designed it, and nobody defending it on the morning of May 18, had built in an answer for what was coming up the hill on Marsh's back. What Imperial Japanese planners did not fully account for was a weapon their own manuals underestimated. One that turned the very caves meant to neutralize American firepower into kill boxes with no second exit. And what almost nobody outside a handful of Marines and a handful of engineers back in Maryland understood was that this weapon on Marsh's back was famous for the wrong reason. Because there are 2 mistakes buried in the story of the M2 flamethrower. One of them is real, a documented, admitted, embarrassing mechanical failure that killed American units and forced the Chemical Warfare Service to stop an assembly line and start over. The other mistake exists only in barrack stories, war movies, and 80 years of folklore. A myth about how this weapon supposedly gave its own operator away. A myth that soldiers half believed and that Hollywood fully believed. And that turns out to have almost no basis in acoustics, tactics, or a single captured enemy document. The difference in how the United States Army treated these 2 flaws, The real one and the imagined one is not a footnote. It is the entire reason the weapon on Elias Marsh's back worked on May 18, 1945, when it mattered most. To understand why, we don't start at Sugar Loaf. We start 3 years earlier in a testing yard in Maryland with a design that everyone already knew was broken. Before there was a flaw to fix, there was a young engineer named Walter Hine, a composite figure representing the small, largely anonymous engineering staff, the Chemical Warfare Service assigned to flame weapon development at Edgewood Arsenal, Maryland, beginning in 1940. Hine, as we're constructing him here, grew up in Elkton, a few miles up the road from the arsenal itself, the son of a machinist at a canning equipment plant. He never attended a 4-year engineering college. What he had instead was 6 years on his father's shop floor, learning to read pressure gauges, valve seats, and gasket failures the way other boys his age read box scores. When the Army's Chemical Warfare Service put out a call in 1940 for machinists and toolmakers with experience in pressurized fuel systems, Hine's shop floor resume got him through the door that a diploma might not have. The weapon he was assigned to did not yet have a name that mattered. It existed as a series of experimental prototypes. The E1, tested in 1940, redesigned by March 1941 into the E1R1 under contract with the Kincaid Company, which separated the compressed nitrogen propellant from the fuel reservoir for the first time, a design decision that would carry forward into every American flamethrower built for the rest of the war. The E1R1 weighed 57 pounds filled, could sustain a stream for 15 to 20 seconds at a range of 15 to 20 yards, and promptly failed its field trials on exactly the point that would haunt the program for the next 3 years: ignition. Hine's first weeks on the testing yard were spent doing the unglamorous work nobody wrote up in the final reports, logging how many trigger pulls it took before a given unit's battery lost enough charge to weaken the spark, timing how long a hydrogen line held pressure after being dragged through wet sand, cataloging which valve seats corroded fastest in the arsenal's saltwater immersion tank. It was not the kind of work that made a man's name. It was the kind of work that, done badly, got other men killed a year and a half later on the other side of the world. Nobody explained that connection to him directly. He understood it anyway, the way anyone who has fixed machines for a living understands that a part which fails on a bench will fail worse in the field. The mechanism was simple in theory and treacherous in practice. A small hydrogen reservoir mounted alongside the flame gun's barrel released gas to a nozzle where a battery-fed electric spark was supposed to ignite it, producing a small pilot flame. That pilot flame, in turn, was meant to ignite the main fuel stream as it left the gun under nitrogen pressure. It required a battery to hold its charge in tropical humidity, a spark gap to stay clean of carbon fouling, and a hydrogen line to stay pressurized and leak-free. 3 separate points of failure stacked on top of each other, every one of them vulnerable to mud, salt water, and the simple wear of a weapon carried on a man's back through jungle terrain for days at a time. By March 1942, The test board results from Edgewood pushed the design into a heavier, more rugged configuration standardized as the M1. It reached the South Pacific by the end of that same year, and while the Chemical Warfare Service in Maryland was refining valve housings and shoulder straps, Adolf Hitler's Wehrmacht was 6 months from the disaster at Stalingrad, and Imperial Japan's High Command was still absorbing the loss at Midway. The M1 was not a footnote weapon. It was rushed into a war already accelerating on every front, with production schedules that left almost no room for a redesign. The redesign became necessary anyway. In December 1942, on Guadalcanal, American forces attempted their first flamethrower assault against a fortified Japanese position. It failed, not because the tactic was wrong, but because the weapon itself would not reliably light. Marines in the field developed their own workaround almost immediately. Burning scraps of paper, cupped matches, cigarette lighters held to the nozzle by hand, anything that could substitute for a battery spark that too often produced nothing but a dry click and a hiss of unignited fuel spraying uselessly into the air 10 feet from an enemy machine gun nest. The 1943 follow-up, the M1A1, solved a different problem entirely. Chemical Warfare Service engineers, working from after-action reports flooding back from the Pacific, added a thickening agent to the fuel itself. Napalm, developed that same year, which turned the weapon's spray from a thin, wind-scattered mist into a compact, sticky stream that could be lobbed like a rope of fire 50 yards into a pillbox aperture, more than double the M1's original range. It was, in every respect but one, a better weapon. The one respect it wasn't better in was the one that mattered most in combat. The ignition system, battery, spark gap, hydrogen line, all 3 failure points carried over from the M1 completely unchanged, which meant the Marine on Guadalcanal, and the soldier following him onto Bougainville, and the Marine assaulting the first Japanese positions on New Britain, was still carrying a weapon that might, at the exact moment his life depended on it, produce nothing more than a hiss. Most armies that discover a flaw like this in a weapon already being manufactured by the tens of thousands do one of 2 things. They issue a field bulletin telling soldiers to work around it, or they quietly note it for the next model year and keep the assembly line running. Because a production halt in the middle of a 2-front war is not a decision any officer wants their name attached to. Both options share the same underlying logic. The war will not wait. The requisitions keep coming from theater commanders, and an imperfect weapon in a soldier's hands today is worth more than a perfect one that doesn't exist yet. It is, on the surface, a defensible logic. Documented ignition failure rates from Pacific after-action reports made clear exactly how bad the M1A1's problem was, and the pressure to simply live with it, patch it, and keep shipping units was real and constant. What the United States Army chose to do next was neither of the 2 easy options. It was slower, more expensive, and harder to justify in a procurement meeting. To understand why anyone signed off on it, we have to go inside the office where that decision actually got made. By the middle of 1943, The file crossing chemical warfare service desks at Edgewood Arsenal carried a designation that meant nothing to anyone outside a small circle of engineers and procurement officers. E3. It was the internal experimental label for what would eventually become the M2. The man we're calling Walter Hine, our composite stand-in for the development branch engineers who did this work, was by 1943 3 years into his assignment, no longer the shop floor transplant learning military nomenclature, but a working member of a team compiling something close to a formal indictment of their own earlier design. Nobody's name from that room appears in a textbook. That is itself the point. The people who fixed the flaw were not the people who got remembered for the weapon. They were engineers doing their job in a building nobody photographed. The file itself would have looked unremarkable to anyone outside the program. Typed pages, mimeographed test summaries, a stack of failure logs cross-referenced against unit reports mailed back from the Pacific by supply officers who had no idea their complaints were being compiled into a case for redesign. There was no ceremony to it. Nobody stood up in a meeting and announced that the M1A1 had been a mistake. The file simply accumulated, week after week, until the weight of the evidence made the conclusion difficult to avoid. The ignition system had to go, in its entirety, not be patched again. What the E3 file documented, point by point, was a full abandonment of the battery and hydrogen ignition system in favor of something almost defiantly low-tech. A revolver-style ignition cylinder, mounted at the base of the flame gun, holding 5 separate pyrotechnic cartridges. Each pull of the front trigger rotated the cylinder and struck one cartridge, producing a hot, waterproof, self-contained pilot flame with no battery, no spark gap, and no exposed hydrogen line to leak or foul. It was, mechanically, closer to a 5-shot revolver than to the delicate electrical system it replaced, and that was exactly the point. A revolving cartridge either fires or it doesn't. There is no humidity-sensitive spark gap in the middle of the process to fail quietly. Where the old system depended on a battery holding its charge, a spark gap staying clean, and a hydrogen line staying pressurized all at once, the new cartridge system depended on exactly one thing: a sealed pyrotechnic charge and a firing pin, the same basic principle already trusted in millions of small arms carried by the same soldiers who would carry this weapon. That was the engineering logic behind the redesign in plain terms. Stop trying to keep a fragile electrical circuit dry in a jungle, and replace it with something a rifleman already understood in his bones. The new design paired this with an auto shutoff valve at the nozzle itself, which sealed automatically the instant the operator released the trigger, eliminating the dribble of unignited fuel that had made the old design dangerous to the man carrying it. Here is the paragraph that matters most in this entire story. In 1943, the German Wehrmacht was still fielding the Flammenwerfer 41 with essentially the same category of electrically triggered ignition system it had used since the start of the war, heavier than its American counterpart by roughly 11 pounds, and never substantially redesigned at the ignition stage for the balance of the conflict. The Imperial Japanese Army fielded the Type 93 flamethrower in relatively limited numbers, without the industrial capacity or institutional urgency to pursue a comparable ignition redesign once its early war models reached the field. The British Army, having identified similar reliability concerns in its own man-portable flame weapons, made a different kind of concession entirely. It essentially abandoned large-scale infantry flamethrower deployment in favor of armored, tank-mounted Churchill crocodiles, protecting the operator by removing him from the front line rather than fixing the weapon he would have carried on his back. Each of these armies, faced with a version of the same mechanical problem, found a way to keep going. The U.S. Army stopped the assembly line. M1A1 production, which had been running at pace to meet the demands of the expanding Pacific Campaign, was wound down through late 1943 and into 1944 as tooling at contracted manufacturing plants, including the Beatty Manufacturing Company facility in Little Falls, New Jersey, one of the primary contractors handling flame weapon assembly, was retooled to produce the new E3 design, standardized for service as the M2. Retooling an assembly line in the middle of a two-theater war is not a dramatic gesture. It is a quiet, expensive, unglamorous sacrifice measured in lost production days at a moment when every chemical warfare service unit in the Pacific was asking for more flamethrowers, not fewer. Deliveries of the new M2 reached combat units unevenly. It saw its first major Pacific combat use on Guam in the summer of 1944, while units fighting in Italy would not see the new model arrive until March of 1945, a gap of nearly a year that reflects exactly how large a logistical undertaking a full model changeover actually was. The causal chain here is not complicated, but it is easy to miss if you only look at the weapon's final form. If the Chemical Warfare Services Development Branch had not compiled that E3 file, had not gotten a sign-off to halt M1A1 production, and eat the retooling cost in the middle of 1943, the flamethrowers reaching the Pacific through 1944 and 1945 would still have carried the old battery and hydrogen ignition system. The same system that failed on Guadalcanal in December 1942. The same system Marines had already learned to distrust enough to carry matches as a backup plan. 10 months later, on a muddy hillside called Sugar Loaf, on Okinawa, that difference would not be theoretical. It would be the difference between a weapon that worked when Elia's Marsh needed it to, and one that clicked and hissed at the mouth of a cave. Not everyone in the U.S. military establishment believed the redesigned flamethrower would hold up. Ordnance Board evaluators reviewing early E3 prototypes in 1943 raised specific concerns about the pyrotechnic ignition cylinder's performance under sustained jungle humidity and repeated mud immersion. The same conditions that had already destroyed confidence in the M1A1. Field reports questioned whether a mechanical cartridge system, exposed to the same corrosive salt air and monsoon rain as everything else on a Pacific island, would prove any more reliable in practice than the electrical system it replaced. On paper, skepticism was reasonable. The M1A1 had also looked good in testing. The doubt was not idle bureaucratic caution. Every unit that had carried the M1 or M1A1 into the Pacific had a story about a hiss instead of a flame, and those stories traveled fast through the ranks of men who would soon be issued the replacement. Confidence, once broken by a weapon that failed at the worst possible moment, does not repair itself just because an engineering file says the problem has been solved. The only thing that would actually settle the argument was combat, a real cave, a real defender, and a weapon that either worked or didn't in front of witnesses who would talk about it afterward regardless of what the test reports said. The unit that would answer that skepticism definitively was the 6th Marine Division, the newest division in the Marine Corps order of battle, formed overseas in the Solomon Islands in 1944 and built around veterans of the Guam campaign folded in with green replacements. By early May 1945, elements of the division's 22nd and 29th Marine Regiments were assigned to break the western anchor of the Japanese Shuri Line, a modest, unassuming rise of coral and volcanic rock the Marines had nicknamed Sugar Loaf Hill, barely 75 feet high and 300 yards long, defended by an entire dug-in Japanese regiment under General Mitsuru Ushijima's 32nd Army. Corporal Elias Marsh, the composite Marine we opened on, had spent the 18 months before the war working the floor of a small engine repair garage outside Toledo, Ohio, the kind of job that taught a man to trust his hands with pressurized acetylene tanks and to distrust anything that clicked when it should have fired. It made him, without anyone planning it that way, exactly the right kind of man to carry the new M2. May 12, 1945. Company G of the 22nd Marines crosses 900 yards of open ground toward Sugar Loaf's northern slope with confidence. It looks from a distance like a quick objective. It is not. Japanese gunners dug into a mutually supporting triangle of positions across Sugar Loaf, Half Moon Hill, and Horseshoe Ridge. Open interlocking machine gun and mortar fire the instant the Marines commit to the open ground, and the assault stalls in minutes. Over the following 6 days, the hill changes hands repeatedly. Marines take the crest and are driven off it. They take it again. Company G is reduced to 75 able-bodied men after the first day alone. By May 18, when Marsh's battalion moves into position for what will be one of the final assaults, the tactic has been refined into something the Marines call corkscrew and blowtorch. A Browning automatic rifleman lays down suppressing fire against a cave mouth while a flamethrower operator closes to within effective range inside 60 feet. Well within the reach of Japanese small arms fire the whole way in. Rain is still falling. The slope is still mud. Marsh crosses the last 20 yards low, weapon cradled against his chest, boots slipping on coral rubble slick with runoff and worse. A round cracks past his shoulder close enough to hear the air split. He does not stop. Marsh advances behind the covering fire, drops to one knee at 20 yards, and triggers the gun. The ignition cylinder fires on the first pull. There is no hiss, no dry click, no 10 seconds of exposure waiting for a spark that might never come. A rope of burning napalm arcs into the cave mouth and holds there, clinging to the rock the way the old thin-fuel M1 never could. The roar of it swallows every other sound on that stretch of hillside for a full second. Inside, in the enclosed volume of an Okinawan tomb converted into a firing position, the flame consumes the available oxygen as fast as it consumes anything flammable, a mechanism of the weapon almost as lethal as the fire itself in a sealed defensive position. Marsh empties a second burst into the same aperture before falling back behind the bar man's covering fire. The whole exchange lasting under 15 seconds from trigger pull to withdrawal. Japanese defensive doctrine had planned for American riflemen, American artillery, and American air power. Post-war interrogations and captured unit diaries from Okinawa's cave defenses describe a specific, recurring terror among Japanese defenders that outranked every other American weapon on the island. Soldiers who could calmly endure naval gunfire from offshore battleships broke under the prospect of a flame weapon reaching the mouth of their position. Because there was no doctrine, no fortification design, no act of individual courage that offered a defense against it once it arrived. The doctrine of drawing Americans into close range to negate their firepower advantage had, in the case of the flamethrower, drawn them into exactly the range at which this particular weapon worked best. The small human detail that tells you everything about how Marines felt about the redesigned weapon is not found in an after-action report. It's found in who wanted to carry it. Flamethrower operators on Okinawa were rotated deliberately. The job was exhausting and dangerous. The 68-pound tank group made a man slow and an obvious target, and casualty rates among flame operators ran high. And yet requests to be assigned the weapon, rather than orders compelling a man to take it, appear repeatedly in unit narratives from the Shuri line fighting. Marines who had watched the old M1A1 hiss and fail in earlier campaigns did not have to be convinced the new gun was different. They had already seen it work. Sugar Loaf Hill finally fell to the 6th Marine Division on May 18, 1945, at a cost the division would carry for the rest of its history. 2,662 killed and wounded in 10 days, with another 1,289 Marines evacuated for combat fatigue, casualty numbers approaching those of the entire 3-day battle for Tarawa. But the hill fell. And with its fall, the western anchor of Ushijima's Shuri line came apart, opening the road toward Naha, and 11 days later, the fall of Shuri Castle itself. If you have seen a single World War II combat film with a flamethrower in it, you have probably seen this scene. A soldier tracking a target through jungle at night, and just before he fires, a faint mechanical click from the ignition mechanism gives him away. The enemy hears it, ducks, or gets the drop on him in the 2 seconds before the flame arrives. It is a durable piece of battlefield folklore, repeated in memoirs, retold in bars by men who never carried the weapon themselves, and dramatized in movies for 80 years. The idea that the M2's own ignition system was its Achilles heel, betraying its operator's position with an audible tell in the instant before firing. The legend is seductive precisely because it sounds like the kind of detail only someone who was really there would know, too specific, too mechanical, too unglamorous to be Hollywood invention on its own. It has the texture of insider knowledge, which is exactly why it spread so easily from veteran to novelist to screenwriter, each retelling sanding down the uncertainty, until what began as a soldier's private worry hardened into an accepted fact of the weapon's design. It is the kind of detail a documentary would love to have be true, because it is dramatic, cinematic, and just plausible enough that nobody thought to check it against the actual noise of a battlefield. It does not survive contact with the actual noise of the battlefield it supposedly happened on. Combat on Okinawa's Shuri Line in May 1945 was not a quiet affair interrupted occasionally by gunfire. It was continuous naval gunfire support from offshore battleships, sustained mortar and artillery exchange, small arms fire from a dozen directions at once, and the general roar of a division-scale assault grinding across broken terrain. Acoustically, a small mechanical click from a hand-carried weapon at a range of 20 to 60 feet is not a signal rising above that noise floor. It is inaudible, swallowed entirely by everything else already happening around it. Even granting the enemy perfect hearing and zero surrounding noise, the tactical math does not support the legend either. A Japanese defender inside a cave or pillbox aperture, hearing some hypothetical click, would have perhaps 2 to 3 seconds before the flame gun stream arrived. Not enough time to relocate inside a fixed firing position. Not enough time to bring a weapon to bear on a target. He likely could not see clearly to begin with, since flamethrower teams deliberately worked from covered approaches and blind angles specifically to deny defenders a clean shot. And on the documentary side, no captured Japanese training manual instructs soldiers to listen for an ignition sound as a countermeasure, and no post-war interrogation record, among the substantial archive compiled by U.S. military historians and later researchers, cataloging Japanese defensive doctrine on Okinawa, describes Japanese troops using auditory detection of a flamethrower's ignition as a battlefield tactic. The threat Japanese defenders described consistently was the flame itself and the total absence of any counter to it once it arrived, not a warning sound beforehand. This absence of evidence matters more than it might first appear. Japanese defensive doctrine on Okinawa was, in most other respects, exhaustively documented. Captured manuals, unit diaries, and interrogation transcripts describe in specific detail how defenders were trained to identify American tank approach routes, to recognize the sound of different American artillery calibers incoming, and to time their exposure to avoid naval gunfire barrages. Where the doctrine was thorough about identifiable threats, its total silence on any flamethrower-specific auditory warning is itself informative. If a mechanical ignition tell had been a real, exploitable vulnerability, an army this meticulous about cataloging American tactics would very likely have written it down somewhere. It didn't, because there was nothing there to write down. None of this means the soldiers who believed the legend were foolish. Combat, and jungle and cave combat especially, is an environment of near-total sensory overload where every variable a man can identify feels like it might be the one that saves his life. Folklore fills the gaps that formal doctrine leaves open, and a flamethrower operator's death, when it happened, and it happened often, given how exposed the job made a man, needed an explanation that made sense to the survivors standing nearby. He got caught by the click is a more satisfying story than he was in range of small arms fire for 6 seconds longer than anyone else on the line, even if the second explanation is closer to what an after-action report would actually say. And this is the paragraph that is the entire point of this video. The real flaw in this weapon, the battery and hydrogen ignition system that failed audibly and visibly, that Marines already knew to distrust by the time they hit Guadalcanal, was documented in engineering files, tested against Ordnance Board skepticism, and physically retooled out of the production line more than a year before Sugar Loaf Hill. The imagined flaw, the telltale click, was never fixed because it never needed to be. It did not exist outside of memory and myth. An institution capable of the kind of rigor that halts an active production line over a documented mechanical failure was, by the same rigor, also capable of correctly ignoring a threat that didn't hold up under acoustic or tactical scrutiny. Call it institutional discipline, if you want a name for it. The same discipline that says yes to an expensive fix when the evidence demands it, and no to an expensive fix when the evidence doesn't. By the time the last organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa collapsed on June 21, 1945, the Flamethrower, the redesigned M2, not the M1A1 that had failed a Marine assault on Guadalcanal 2.5 years earlier, had become one of the primary tools for breaking a doctrine that had cost the United States more casualties than any other single battle in the Pacific War. Roughly 12,000 Americans killed. Well over 100,000 Japanese military dead, including General Ushijima himself, who took his own life in a cave near the island's southern tip rather than surrender. The 82-day battle for Okinawa was, in scale and duration, the closest preview the Allies had of what an invasion of the Japanese home islands would actually cost. And the cave-then-tunnel defensive doctrine the Japanese army had built specifically to negate American firepower had, in the case of the flamethrower, been defeated by the one weapon their doctrine hadn't accounted for. Trace the chain all the way back, and it holds without a single broken link. Engineers at Edgewood Arsenal spending 3 years compiling field failures into an internal case file. That file admitting, in plain language, that the ignition system was unfit for combat. A quiet decision to halt an active production line mid-war and absorb the retooling cost. A redesigned weapon reaching Guam in 1944, and the Shuri line by the spring of 1945. And a division of Marines at Sugar Loaf Hill, carrying that weapon into a cave-clearing fight the old design would very likely have lost. The most credible endorsement of the flamethrower's value on Okinawa didn't come from a chemical warfare officer with a stake in the program's success. It came from the infantry commanders who had to actually clear the caves. Marine and Army after-action assessments from the Shuri line fighting repeatedly rated the flamethrower, alongside close tank support and demolition charges, as indispensable to reducing fortified cave positions that small arms and direct artillery fire had failed to crack. The kind of unglamorous, repeated professional judgment that carries more weight than any single quotable line, because it shows up independently across report after report. As for the engineers who fixed the flaw, the composite figure we followed through this story, and the real development branch he represents, history, did not give them much. There was no ticker tape parade for the men who redesigned an ignition cylinder. Most left Edgewood Arsenal after the war for ordinary civilian engineering jobs, their names surviving only in procurement files and technical manuals like TM 3376A, filed away in Army archives rather than history books. The M2 flamethrower itself outlived the war that produced it by decades, refined into the M2A1 for Korea, the M9A17 for Vietnam, before newer incendiary weapons finally replaced it. Collectors and historical armorers still fire preserved, deactivated M2 units at private ranges today, the same cartridge-based ignition system firing on the first pull, exactly as it was built to in 1943. What this story actually teaches has less to do with fire and more to do with institutions. The United States Army in 1943 was capable of two things that don't usually travel together: the humility to admit, in writing, that a weapon already being manufactured by the thousands was dangerously flawed, and the discipline to spend money and time fixing exactly that flaw and no others, including the one that lived only in soldiers' imaginations and needed no fixing at all. That is a harder standard to meet than it sounds, and it is worth asking, the next time you hear a piece of military folklore repeated as fact, which category it actually belongs in. If your father or grandfather carried a flamethrower or fought alongside a man who did or crossed paths with the Shuri Line, Sugar Loaf, Peleliu, or any of the other Cave-Endridge fights across the Pacific, tell us the unit, the island, and the date in the comments. These stories only survive because families keep passing them down. Somewhere south of Naha, in the days after Sugar Loaf finally fell, Corporal Elias Marsh keeps carrying the same weight on his back. He still checks the igniter housing without looking at it. He still knows exactly the number of times it has failed him: 0.